What is going on, guys, and welcome back to the channel. So as a lot of you know, this is our super cheap turbo Civic build. We've been building this thing on the channel over the course of the last couple months, doing everything as cheap as we possibly can, but still functional. So when we originally put this car together, we were using a wideband from a buddy that we had borrowed, and it was working out good, but understandably he needed that thing back so that he could tune some other cars. So keeping with the theme of the super cheap budget Civic build, instead of going out and buying a $200 to $300 gauge setup, we hopped on Facebook Marketplace and we were able to track one down for $60 shipped to our house. We decided to go with an Innovate just because that's what we were able to find. So in today's video, we're gonna get it mounted, wired in, and hooked up to our Hondata ECU. So let's get through the intro and jump right into today's video. Now that we've gotten through the intro, let's take a look at the setup we will be installing today. This is an Innovate Motorsports MTX-L, and it utilizes a LSU 4.9 sensor. And in my opinion, for $60, this thing was a total steal. We've got everything we need to make this work for our car today. This gauge is able to be daisy chained with other Innovate Motorsports gauges. We're not going to be using that, so we'll just tuck those to the side. So all we're really going to need today is the sensor and harness, and then this lead right here, which has all of your important wires that we're going to be using today. We're going to use black for ground, red for power, white is for a dimmer so we can hook that into the headlights if we choose, and then yellow is going to be our signal going to our Hondata ECU, and then brown we're just going to tuck up and tape off out of the way because we don't need it. I will leave a link for the instruction manual for this gauge just in case you guys want to check it out. But first thing we're going to do is start off up here at the turbo, get the sensor mounted in our downpipe, and then we will start working back from there. As with buying anything used on Facebook Marketplace, I always recommend trying it before we get this thing fully installed. So before we put the gauge in the car and get everything all wired up nice and neat, we will get the gauge hooked up and just test it out real quick, make sure that it seems to be reading properly. So let's get this sensor in so that we can test out the gauge. Before we test out the gauge, I want to do a free air calibration on the sensor. So I've got it clamped up here for when the heater circuit kicks on, it doesn't melt anything or burn me. But to engage the free air calibration, what we are going to do is have the sensor unplugged from the gauge. We're going to hook the gauge up to power and ground so that it will kick on and cycle. It should display an error code. We'll let it sit there for about 30 to 40 seconds, and then we will disconnect it from power, plug the sensor back in, then hook it up back to power, and it should go through a heater cycle and then go into calibration. Let's get the free air calibration done so we can start testing the gauge. Now we're going to engage our free air calibration. We're going to hook this up. I've got power hooked up. We'll hook this up to ground for about 30 seconds. Should display E2, which it is. So we're going to let it sit there, like I said, 30 to 40 seconds. Alright, so it's been about 30 seconds, so I'm going to go ahead and disconnect it. Now we can go ahead and plug our gauge back into our sensor here. And now we can go ahead and hook this back up again. Should cycle. It's doing heater now. There we go, calibration. Once it does that, it should display. So I completely forgot to cover this in the video, but as you can see, after we did the calibration, the gauge started displaying code E8, which typically means a bad or faulty sensor, which in our case, that was the case. We had a bad sensor, so I reached out to the gentleman that we bought this setup from, and he was super cool about it, sent us some money back, got us taken care of. We ordered a new Innovate sensor for our setup, and we were good to go. First thing we're going to do is take the plug out of our O2 sensor bung here. Innovate wants you to put the plug 24 inches after the turbo. In our case, we're a little bit closer than that, but it's going to be just fine. But they do recommend 24 inches so that the sensor doesn't get as hot and it'll last a little longer. So we'll get our plug out, set this to the side, grab our sensor. This thing looks brand new pretty much. That's plenty tight enough. Now we need to make a hole in the firewall big enough for this plug to pass through so that we can plug the sensor into the gauge once we get that inside the car. So we're going to use a step bit and drill right through this firewall. Now we can feed this plug through. Now that that's good to go, we can decide how we want to route this over to our sensor. From our sensor, we ran it down underneath the radiator hose, up along here, under the throttle body, and then back to the plug that we decided to mount right there. And then we have all of the wiring that's going to the battery and everything else in this loom right here to make it look as nice as we can. I mean, this thing's a wiring mess to begin with from the manual swap. We've still got all the wiring for an automatic transmission, so not the cleanest thing wiring wise, but our wideband install came out pretty good. Comes right out of the firewall there, runs over to that plug, and then goes off where it needs to go. So looks pretty good. I'm happy with that part of it. Let's move to the inside of the car. So now that we've got the wires ran through the firewall into the cabin of the car, we need to decide where we're going to put our gauge. I want it in my line of sight, so we're going to put it up here on the A pillar, and then we'll just have to run a wire all the way over to the ECU so that we can tap in for data logging. But we're going to put it right here. So to do that, I hopped on Amazon and I found this cheap little universal pillar mount. It's just a single gauge. They have multi-gauge ones of these as well. Mine, I believe, is a GlowShift, but this is the part number. I'll link it in the description below. Again, it was only like $10, so it's not perfect, but I actually don't think it's going to be bad. So the way I'd like to do it is get this mounted down as low as possible, something kind of like that. Again, fitment isn't 100% perfect. It's got a little bit of a gap right up in there, but I think we can trim that lip back and it'll fit tighter. And then it also overhangs here. I thought I ordered one for a Civic, but when it came, it says universal. It might be universal or it might be for the other body style, not the hatchback. I'm gonna get some painter's tape and tape this whole pillar up so that we can draw in here with a Sharpie so we know where this needs to land, so we can drill the hole for the wiring and everything. Then we can trim this back, get that fitting nice, do any modification we want to try to trim that or anything to try to make that fit a little bit better. Get this A pillar off, and then we can start getting the gauge mounted and wired. So we've got the pillar all taped up. Now we can go ahead and set the gauge pod back on there and trace it out on the tape so that we know what we're working with when we take this whole piece out. Now that we got the pillar all taped up, I'm going to go ahead and work with the gauge pod itself, sand it down a little bit until we get this thing fitting how we want. And then we have to get this whole A pillar out so we can drill our hole, get our wires ran, and all that good stuff. So let's work on the pod first, get it fitting nice, and then we'll go from there. We've got the gauge pod fitting much better now. I'm a lot happier with that. So now we're gonna work on getting this whole A pillar off. Not 100% sure how it pops off, but we'll figure it out. So I'm gonna take this screw out that's right here, and then we'll start working on trying to get this thing off so we can drill a hole to run our wires through and get this thing ready to go together. As you guys can see, I've got the A pillar almost all the way out, but I'm not gonna lie to you guys, I ripped half this car apart trying to do it. We've got this whole panel all the way to the back pretty loose, mainly because I had to get this piece past this lip. I ended up just pulling the seatbelt bolt out that goes right here, and then prying it by this lip. Definitely not the right way to do it, but it worked for us. It's going to be fun to put it back together. So let's go ahead, get this pillar the rest of the way out so we can get our gauge pod fitted up to it nice and neat, and then we will get our hole drilled and get this thing ready to go back in with the new gauge mounted to it. So we've got our hole marked. I'm gonna go ahead and just double check it with our pod. We're gonna use a step bit to drill it. I was just using the hole saws to make a mark because it was easier. I'm just gonna verify it's where I want it. Pod's gonna end up somewhere about there. I think that's gonna work out just fine for us. Let's go ahead and get that drilled out. I think that's going to work out just about perfect for us. I'm going to go ahead and grab the gauge, set it in here, feed the wires through, and just make sure that it's the right size and in the right spot, and we will be good to go. So it's going to be something just like that with the wires coming through like so. It actually worked out in a perfect spot, so super happy with that. We'll get that trimmed back, then we're going to figure out what we want to do to mount this and fasten it to the A-pillar itself so that it's going to stay nice and flush and look halfway decent, so that we can get this thing back in the car. Now that we've got this side of it shaved down so that it fits good, we're going to go ahead and trim along this line so that it doesn't have any overhang once it's on the pillar. Alright, so now it's time to do some wiring. I've decided we're going to use a 5-pin connector. I've got a nice little connector kit, and we're going to run all 5 of these wires into the connector. Whichever ones we don't need, we won't run out the other side. This way, if we ever want to use one of those wires that we're not using now, all we have to do is tap into the one side of the plug, and if we ever need to take the pillar or gauge or pod or whatever out for some reason, it's a simple, easy one plug connection. So I'm going to go ahead and get these made up so they're ready to go, and then we can go over to the car and actually start running some wires. So now that we're ready to start wiring on the car, I wanted to make sure that our gauge was going to stay in our pod nice and tight and not flop around on us. So since we got this gauge used, we didn't get any of the bracketry that holds it in the actual pod. So I had this little metal strap laying around. I put a 90-degree bend on it up here and drilled a hole. And we're just going to put it like this with a nut to hold it tight. I'm going to cut it off right there, and this should push up against that pod and hold the gauge nice and firm in its place. So let's get this cut, get it mounted in the pod, and then we can start wiring on the car. Alright, now it's not going to go anywhere. It's in there nice and tight for us. You're never going to see that behind the pod, so that's looking perfectly fine. So I went ahead and put ends on these 4 wires, so once we get them ran, all we have to do is pop them into the connector, plug it into the gauge, and we'll be good to go. So to run through these real quick, we're going to be using the cigarette lighter fuse for our red wire. That's going to power the gauge on and off with the key. Then for ground, we're actually going to run this right out to the battery so that we know it has a nice, good, clean ground. This one is going to go to our Hondata S300. It's going to be an analog input into the ECU so that we can see it when we're data logging. So this white wire we're going to tap into our headlights so that when we turn the low beams on, the gauge will actually dim. So let's go ahead, head over to the car and get this thing wired up. Now we're working on running our ground wire for the gauge. So we've got it ran through the firewall with everything else. And we're going to come all the way over to our battery ground just because I want a really nice clean connection for the sensor. So I'm going to go back through now that we have the length, route it where we want it, and get an eyelet put on it and hook it up to the battery. Now we can plug this right into our ECU. I do it with plugs off of our jumper harness. I tap into the wiring on the cheap harness itself with plugs, just like we have here. So if we want to go back to air conditioning, we can plug that in there, because right now I'm using that for water methanol injection. So I did the same thing with our wideband, just using a plug. We'll plug in right there and it'll be good to go. This way, if we ever need our wideband signal for something else, or on the dyno they want to use it for something, whatever the case may be, all we have to do is simply unplug it instead of cut and splice and all that other stuff. So we're gonna get this plugged in, then we can go back to the other side. So we've got almost all the wiring finished off here. As you guys seen, we ran this black one through the firewall, grounded it at the battery, so it's got a good ground. This one we ran over to our ECU so that the ECU can pick up the signal from the wideband. Then our power wire, we ended up using a fuse tap just like this one so that we could steal a circuit off of our cigarette lighter. And then this white one here is the one we're doing right now. It's our last wire. We're gonna use another fuse tap like this so that we can tap into the signal from our headlights. So when we turn our headlights on, it should dim the gauge. So we're gonna go ahead and get this spliced together, tapped in, and then we should be just about ready to start putting this thing together. Now that we've got the wiring on the car done, we've got to get this mounted to the A-pillar. The way we're going to do that is with these little screws. They actually came with this pod. I'm going to drill a hole in this that's a little bigger than the screw, and then we're going to drill a very, very tiny hole in the A-pillar so that these can screw in and hopefully hold this nice and tight. We were going to try Velcro, but I think these little screws might actually do the trick. So let's get this drilled out, and then we'll start mounting it to that. Perfect. So we're going to do that to all 4 of these, and then we'll do a tiny little pilot hole on that, and we should be good to go. Not bad. It's not horrible, not fantastic, but it's gonna work. So let's go ahead and throw this thing on the car. Now that we've got all these wires ran up through the dash, we can go ahead and put them in this connector. So when we bring our gauge in, it'll just plug right in. Make sure if you do it this way that you do the plug in the same orientation that you did the other plug. So we've got black is on number 1 for us. And then on the other plug we have yellow, but like I said, we're using this one here for our signal. Put our little lock on. Just like so. Now we can bring the gauge and pillar in here, get both of these plugged in, and start getting all the interior back together. Alright, so we've got this thing kind of back together here. We've got the A-pillar back in, we've got our gauge in. This is definitely the worst part of this project, is getting these pieces back in. They just kind of suck to work with, but it's on. The gauge is nice and tight, it's not floppy or anything. We've still got to put all the back of the car back together, but for now this is going to be fine. We'll go ahead and test this thing before we go any further, make sure it's good to go. Then we can take this thing for a ride and make sure it all works. Alright guys, so it is the next day. It ended up getting dark on us last night, but I wanted to get all of the trim panels back together on the car so that it was ready to go for a ride today. So we got everything back together and it looks pretty good. The only thing that I don't love is that the gauge pod is a different color than the trim piece, which you guys can see, but it doesn't look bad. After doing some trimming, the fitment actually came out really good and I like the line of sight for the driver. So super happy about that. Now, before you guys go running this thing, I would definitely recommend doing that free air calibration that we did earlier in the video. I would just do that anytime you have a new sensor or you're putting a new gauge on the car, especially if it's used and you're going to reuse the old sensor. I would do the free air calibration because it just helps it be more accurate when you're using it in the long run. So now that we've got that all taken care of, we can go ahead, move the truck back, get this thing off the quick lift. We're going to grab our laptop and get hooked up to the S Manager software for the Hondata S300 because we were running the AEM gauge on this thing. So I just want to go in there and make sure that the Hondata and the gauge are displaying the same value, because if not, we can modify it a little bit with a voltage offset so that we know we're getting an accurate reading in our data logs. So let's move the truck, get the car off the lift, we'll fire it up and get on the laptop and see what we have to do. So now that we've got the car off the lift, I've got my laptop out here with S Manager pulled up so we can communicate with the Hondata, and we're gonna fire this thing up, let it warm up. I'm gonna show you guys the cycle that our Innovate wideband goes through on startup, and then we will verify that we're getting the same reading here as we are right here, and if we have to mess around with any voltage offset or anything like that so that we get accurate readings. So let's go ahead and fire this thing up. Now, one thing you don't want to do is turn the key on and just let the heater on the O2 sensor constantly run. When you go to start the car, just start it like normal. You don't need to wait for this thing to go through the heat cycle and then start the car. So just come in and just like normal, start this thing up. It'll go through its heater cycle, as you can see right there. And as you can see, it goes right to reading. So now let's go into our Hondata here. See if it wants to link this time. All right, there we go. So now we're linked up. And as you can see, our AFR is reading 13.9 to 14. We've got 14, pretty much 14, 13.9, 14 right there as well. And like I said, it's super easy to do the voltage offset. You just go under closed loop advanced. We've got our wideband input source already selected, and then voltage offset is right there. So it's a nice, easy way to do this. Still a little bit high on the ECU side. So let's go a little bit more. Let's go 28. Alright guys, me from the future real quick. There was one thing in the Hondata that I forgot to show you. So if you go under the parameters tab under closed loop advanced, the same spot that we were adjusting our voltage offset, right below that you will see a small table labeled voltage/lambda conversion table. Now ours is currently still set up for our AEM gauge, and what will happen is even if you get the voltage offset set up correctly and everything looks good at idle, once you start driving and the gauge starts going towards the high or low end of the spectrum, you will notice that the Hondata and the Innovate gauge will get farther and farther off readings from each other, which means that we don't have them scaled correctly. So real quick, I'm going to go in here and show you guys how to rescale this table so that your Hondata and your Innovate gauge will line up. So our new Innovate gauge is going to supply a 0 to 5 volt signal to the Hondata, and the Hondata is going to use this small table to convert that over to an AFR reading to display and for data logging. So we need to make sure that this table is on point for our data log to be accurate. So in the first column you will see 0.00 volts, below that 10.00 air fuel. We need to change the 10.00 to 7.35. Next to that you will see 5.0 volts equals 20.00. We need to change the 20 to 22.39 and then do the same thing with the column after that. change the 20 to 22.39, and then upload this back into the ECU. The Hondata will now know what the Innovate gauge is displaying. So we've got this thing pretty close here. You can see it's pretty close. It's about as close as we're going to be able to get it with the ability we have here. So with mine, I ended up going the offset of negative 0.27. So we're going to run with that. It seems to be pretty spot on. So now that we've got that taken care of, we wrote the file and everything, let's go ahead and go take this thing for a ride. I usually use my phone as a gauge display for boost and stuff like that, but I have the laptop hooked up, so we'll just use that. Wideband seems to be pretty spot on, 14.6, 7, yeah. They're pretty matched up, so I think we're good to go as far as that is concerned. Guys, it looks like we've got this thing reading pretty good, so we're gonna head back to the house, give everything a once over, and make sure we're good. So there you have it, guys. We've got our $60 Facebook Marketplace wideband installed on the super cheap Civic build. Now, I'm not sure what's next for this project, so if you guys have any ideas, let me know down in the comments below. Personally, I'd like to pick up a USDM D16 with VTEC so that we have a nice budget piston and rod combo that we could slap right into it, because this one being the JDM D15B non-VTEC, we don't have a lot of options without tearing it apart and then taking measurements. I'd rather find a nice off-the-shelf cheap setup that we could just slap right in it, but I'm not sure if we're gonna go that route. So like I said, if you guys have any ideas, make sure to let me know in the comments down below. But as always, I appreciate you for checking out the channel. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, ring that bell, and check us out on all of our other social media platforms, Facebook, TikTok, and Bought to Build Official on Instagram. And we will catch you on the next one.